welcome back to my channel. This is Brian Keating. I'm the Chancellor's Distinguished Professor of Physics at UC San Diego. I've been an astronomer for over 40 years, and I hope to convey some of that lifelong learning and loving that I've had of astronomy with some new discoveries that are being made both in optical astronomy and how astronomy relates to the brain. And to do this, we're going to take a tour of the similarities and the differences between the human eyeball and the telescope. The human eyeball is effectively a telescope that you're born with. It has all the features of a modern telescopic camera system, and we'll investigate those, as well as some of the fascinating connections between the eye and the brain. And this is partially in preparation for an upcoming episode of Andrew Huberman's Huberman Lab podcast, which I've been invited upon, and I plan to talk about these similarities with Andrew when I do go on his podcast. Andrew and I have other similarities, such as the fact that we were both inspired in some way to become scientists around the same age by encountering very inexpensive, or as Andrew loves to say, low cost to consumer tools of science. In his case, it was the aquarium and fish. He loved learning about them. He'd collect fish. For me, it was getting a cheap telescope, no bigger than this one, to explore the mysteries of the universe as I could perceive them from my home in Dobbs Ferry, New York. So today, I hope to instill some of that inspiration in you, especially you parents out there. Those of you who are interested can find a buyer's guide for telescopes on my website. We'll put links to all the resources in the show notes below. For those of you who have been here, you know that the telescope has played an important role in my life. I described in my first book, Losing the Nobel Prize, how an encounter with a telescope looking at the moon as a 12-year-old inspired me to become an astronomer and still inspires me to this day, 40 years later. I also work with some of the most brilliant scientists in the world on enormous telescopes, thousands of times bigger than this tiny little telescope that launched me on my astronomical adventures many years ago. I do that in combination with collaborations that I've founded and been a part of for decades, the BICEP collaboration, and now the Simons Array and Simons Observatory collaborations. The Simons Observatory is an observatory unlike any other. It's poised to be the biggest, best, and most expensive observatory of its kind ever made. A lot of the motivation for this video is inspired by my friend Andrew Huberman. We've been talking a while about the fascinating world of the human eye, and I hope to really convince him that the telescope is really one of the few ways at very low cost to consumers, only $50. I don't sell them, but I have a buyer's guide on my website, that you can instill a lifelong love of astronomy in children or even in yourself. I have here some models of the eyeball, and I have telescopes, and we're going to be building telescopes using these powerful lasers and tools that I have here to represent the function of optical elements and instruments in both the human eye and in modern telescopes. We'll also discuss the limitations of telescopes, because what sets a scientist apart is when he or she can indicate where he or she does not understand the functionality or the true behavior of a discovery. So it's not enough to make a discovery. You have to understand what are the limitations of your discovery. So let's dive into what makes the eye nature's first and some say best astronomical instrument. As a kid, I was transfixed by the appearance of the night sky, even to the naked eye, my very first telescope. And then beyond that, with a tiny little $50 refracting telescope, no different from this little one, except it had a better mount, inspired my journey from a young kid in Westchester County, New York, all the way to a professional cosmologist working at the boundaries of the Earth. Now, this video is appearing at a time when a very, very interesting celestial guest may be appearing as well. And that's a comet, which was discovered in 2023, almost accidentally. Originally was thought to be an asteroid. And it goes by a name Shuchinshan-Atlas, discovered by the Asteroid Terrestrial Impact Last Alert System Atlas in South Africa in February of 2023. Over a year after its discovery and more, this object may pass through your eyes and your telescope. And so it's fitting to kind of prepare yourself in this video for what we might be witness to. And have no fear, this is not a last chance for humanity type comment, don't look up situation. I want you to look up. I want you to explore the night sky with your eyes and even with inexpensive telescopes and optical systems. I'm going to give advice for both amateur astronomers and even you pros out there. I know many of my audience are experts in astronomy and astrophotography. I know you're going to really love it. And the resources available to you have never been better. I couldn't imagine in 1986 having a CCD camera with 48 megapixels attached to my telescope to record things, to post on Instagram and show and amaze my friends. It was all naked eye astronomy. Whether you're an advanced amateur astronomer, a professional astronomer, a Nobel Prize winner, or you just stumbled on this channel out of curiosity. I hope you'll enjoy this deep dive into your own refracting telescopes as we go into the cosmos and share this wondrous discoveries of astronomy. For my core viewers, you're going to learn deep principles about the human eye, its physiology, but also its limitations and how you can overcome them to improve your astronomical adventures. We'll explore the similarities between a telescope and the human eye as we dive deep into the anatomy of the human eye and of astronomical telescopes. We'll start by comparing the anatomy of our eye with the design and operating principles of telescopes, refracting telescopes and reflecting telescopes. Then we'll dive into the incredible capabilities of the human eye, explore the fascinating connections between their sensitivity, their resolution, and their color perception properties. In part 3, we'll explore some astronomical tricks that can take advantage of our eye's unique features. These are things that are not present in astronomical telescopes. Part 4, we'll take a historical deep dive into how our understanding of the cosmos has been shaped from primitive telescopes in the 1600s all the way up to the James Webb Space Telescope and even our Simons Observatory in Chile. In part 5, we'll study how we can optimize our vision for truly squeezing every precious last photon out of every observation. And in part 6, stay tuned to the end, where we'll talk about common eye problems, defects, the inevitable byproducts of getting older, and what we can do about it to improve and make the most out of our astronomical observations. Are you ready to dive deep and see the universe through new eyes? Let's go. Let's start by comparing the anatomy of the human eye to that of a telescope. So here's a giant human eye, about the size of some dinosaurs, I suppose. And we're going to take it apart, not surgically. So you see on the outside some features of the eye already, muscles and blood vessels, etc., that we will explore in further detail. We start with the first optical element, which is the cornea. The cornea is actually optically active. It's part of the optical focusing system of the eye. It actually is the first optical element that's encountered. It also protects the eye, and it can suffer from degeneration as time goes on. It's also used in LASIK surgery, as we can do here, bouncing a laser off this. And the laser ablation, created in combination with past guest Donna Strickland, who won the 2018 Nobel Prize, these ultra-high pulse amplification lasers blast away the tissue, the delicate tissue, and sculpt it into a precise form that corrects for deficiencies in the eye's lenses, and also due to degradation of the muscular structure and the physical structure of the eyeball itself. Our retinas are in the back, and it's not shown here in great detail. We'll talk about that, as well as this structure here, the optic nerve, which is responsible for something called the blind spot. We'll talk about the blind spot in section 5. The retina performs the same job as a CCD camera does in a telescope. It actually detects the faint light systems, but it's also the only part of the human brain that's not located in the cranial vault, according to Andrew Huberman. In other words, there's a part of your brain that's not inside of your skull. It's inside the squishy eyeball, and it really belongs inside of your brain. It's quite fascinating the way he describes it. So the retina is a part of your brain in the back of the eyeball, connected to the brain furthermore by this optical nerve and connective tissue there that we'll explore in later sections of the video. The iris is this colored, beautiful colored, distinctive, patterned piece of tissue that changes the pupil, the amount of light that gets in, and that is controlled. The pupil is the actual blank space, the open space here. That's the term that we call, even in optics, for an optical surface that's not magnifying or reducing, but it has controls the aperture, the amount of light that's getting in this case, due to varying conditions of light and dark. Now, a modern day camera can do that automatically, but CCD cameras for telescopes have to be done manually. You have to adjust them as a user or operator, depending on what objects you're looking at. When you're looking at a planet or something in our solar system, you have very different conditions, what's called dynamic range, the ability to change the amount of light getting in to the camera so that it doesn't overwhelm the amplifiers and the computer circuits later down the road. The lens is obviously responsible for focusing light. It's actually pliable. It's frangible. It can be squished and squashed by muscles, these tiny muscles shown here and here, that can restrict or distort physically this semi-solid biological tissue. It's quite incredible that can then change where the focal rays converge in the back of the eye. So this big bubble here is called the vitreous humor. There's nothing funny about that. Although I do have a great astronomy joke. What's the difference between an ophthalmologist and an optometrist? About $150,000 a year. And the properties of the lens and the focus onto the retina are what we turn to next. We can actually model that. In a telescope, there's the equivalent of the pupil of the iris here. It's not as beautifully colored as yours is, I'm sure. And then the amount of light is restricted. You don't want all the light that could possibly enter the lens. The lens is much bigger than this brass disc, the iris size here that restricts the pupil size. In an optical telescope, there's 2 lenses. In our eye, there's only 1. And what's so fascinating, as we'll show in a moment, our eyes focus light to a point or to a focal plane, the retina, but that retinal image is actually upside down. The image that you see is actually the inverse of what's actually happening outside. Because we only have 1 lens, we can't invert the image, as I'll show with these 2 lens systems over here. Although most telescopes use a 2-lens system, and you have an inverted image as well. It is possible to get a right side up image using either reflecting or refracting optics, as we'll see later. So here you see these laser beams coming out, and the laser beams are brought to a focal point over here at some distance away, and that's based on the curvature and the refractive index of the lens. Now, for a telescope, as I said, it has 2 lenses, and typically that's done further to capture the features of the object and present them in a way that will then match to the 3rd lens in the system of an optical telescope. It has 2 lenses itself, one here and one here, but then you also have to take into account the human eyeball has a lens as well at the very end, and then it gets projected onto a retina. And it's stood in for by my finger over here. So this is how a refracting telescope works. There are other types of telescopes called reflecting telescopes. Those use mirrors. Those were invented by Isaac Newton in the 1700s. And they have other features that are superior to those of refracting telescopes. In fact, the biggest refracting telescope on Earth is only about 1 meter in diameter, and even our Simons Observatory telescopes are a good fraction of 1 meter in diameter. And they're some of the biggest telescopes ever made for this type of astronomy that we do. So to get a much bigger telescope, we need a reflecting telescope. We'll talk about those later. So again, the 3 parts of the telescope system that are most analogous to the human eyeball are the lens in the telescope, or the lens in the human eye, the iris, which controls the aperture, how much light goes in through what's called the pupil.
Yep.
And in the human eye, they look like this. And then in the last essential component is the final detector component of the system, which is the retina, or the CCD camera in the case of an astronomical telescope. But again, our eye is a living organ. It's not made of silicon. It's not made of glass and brass. The pupil can change its size. It can be distorted in diameter by tiny muscles that are fed by tiny blood vessels that change the aperture, just the same way you can change the focal the ISO, the exposure, the F number of a telescope or telescopic camera system. The human eye can detect single photons in a properly darkened room. It's just incredible. Now let's talk about light sensitivity and resolution. Our eyes have 2 types of photoreceptors, rods and cones. Rods are extremely sensitive. They're the most lizard-like and ancient of the light-sensing receptors in our retinal system. Cones, on the other hand, are much less sensitive, but they give our eyes color vision. You can remember that as a mnemonic, which is always my favorite Scrabble word, by associating the letter C, cone, with color. They work best in bright light. Telescopes, on the other hand, gather light independent of color, although the lens itself will have what's called chromatic aberration, in that it will focus light to different places depending on the color. That's one of the drawbacks of lens-based telescopes that reflecting telescopes don't have. But since our eye is a refracting telescope or a lens-based telescope, we do have to deal with those issues. It is true that you can actually sense single photons if you're properly prepared. These studies have been done, I believe, in the journal Nature. I'll ask Andrew about that. How sensitive the human eye can be compared to a telescope, compared to a CCD camera, which might have trouble detecting single photons. Of course, a CCD camera can only sense certain wavelengths as well, and eventually the color images may want to be corrected, so-called color correction, and white balance to match what the human eye would see in a similar situation. But one area where our eyes have a huge advantage, even over telescopes, is the wide field of view that we have, over a whopping 150 degrees, almost side to side. Now, some animals can see much farther around, and some have their eyes on the sides of their heads, and some can, like owls, can swivel their eyes around completely. But our wide field of view dwarfs that with even some of the best telescopes. The Hubble Space Telescope had a minor field of view. The James Webb Space Telescope has a minor field of view. Optical telescope that you can buy like this, maybe a few degrees at most, only a few times the full moon, sometimes much less than that. Our wide field of view is one of our greatest advantages over a telescope, along with what's called peripheral vision, which gives us incredible situational awareness. We've evolved to not want things to be able to sneak up from the side because that's how they come to attack us, or at least the way that they did. Imagine if we always looked through a narrow tube with no perspective. We wouldn't be able to see much. And this wide field of view was crucial for early ancestors for their survival, and it's an important trick that we can use to this very day. Averted vision. This is a cool trick that not many people are aware of, but it allows you to be incredibly sensitive, especially at night. If you look slightly away from the image when you're staring through a telescope, most of the time we're staring straight at something we're interested in. That's called the fovea. The fovea effect is what you're looking at. So fovea is the small depression within the retina itself where visual acuity is the highest. It's the central portion of the structure of the eye called the macula, which is responsible for so-called central vision. And it's also sometimes we talk about the fovea as the field of view, the central area that we're most concentrated on. Averted vision takes advantage of the fact that we spend so much time looking at very bright light with our fovea because we want to take in as much information as rapidly as possible for evolutionary purposes. But looking to the side, you expose the less frequently exposed rod cells in the retina to actually use them and recruit them into the purpose of seeing more detail and even lower sensitivity. Now, it's a trick you have to master, but once you do, you can see things much, much fainter than you can with the directly viewing foveal portion of the retina. The fovea has this weird distinction that it's located right next to the optic nerve, which we'll find out gives us the blind spot. So the fovea centralis can sometimes be not the greatest tool for looking through a telescope at faint features. You don't need this when you're looking at the moon or a planet or something bright, however. Now, telescopes achieve color vision via an intriguing trick, which we don't have to make use of because our eyes are sensitive to colors through their cone cells, as I said. All a telescope can see is a 0 and a 1. A CCD camera can either be is a transistor at the most basic level, and it can either be active, high state or a low state in voltage. So it really can only see on or off. So what astronomers and other people do, and your phone does this as well, is it has 3 pixels with different filters or a single pixel divided into 3 parts, red, green, and blue, with a filter in front of each one of them. That actually degrades some of the resolution a slight amount. Because red wavelengths are longer than blue wavelengths, it actually makes certain wavelengths less highly resolved. And experienced astronomers know this fact and take advantage of it. So what astronomers do, they take multiple exposures to get color images through different color filters, but our eyes do this processing instantly. Now, one feature which is common to both optical telescopes and to the human eye is the relative insensitivity to polarized light. So there are 3 major properties of light: its intensity, its polarization, and its spectrum or color. Now, we're familiar with the intensity. Obviously, if you see a bright light, it's impossible not to know about that. And then we know about the colors, rainbows, and all sorts of color vision. That's the spectrum property of light that our eyes are sensitive to. But there's a third property that's incredibly important. As I say often, it's the way the bread gets buttered around the Keating household, and that's polarization. I say the polarization of the cosmic microwave background. But there is an effect that actually can reveal that you will have the capability to see polarized light. It's a phenomenon called Haydnger's brush. It's a phenomenon that allows some of us to detect the presence of polarized light, perceiving it, manifesting in it as an elliptical yellowish, bluish effect on a blue or white background. You can see this. I'll make the screen completely white for a second, and then I'll take it away, and you may see this quadrupolar pattern. And that's attributed to what's called the birefringent structure in the eye, particularly what's called the macular pigment, xanthophyllus. Xanthan, lutein, and mesoxanthinin. Again, I'll have to ask Andrew about this. And this structure around in particular around the fovea, offers some sensitivity to some people to polarized light, which is quite interesting. And some clinicians use Haydnger's brush to assess the functional integrity of the macula and the fovea. The macula has a diameter of about half a centimeter, and the fovea centralis is part of the macula. So sometimes the macula can get degenerated, and you can actually detect that degeneration, what's called age-related macular degeneration, possibly by seeing if a subject can observe Haydnger's brush or not. So don't get scared if you can't see it. I have trouble seeing it sometimes. I don't believe I have macular degeneration, but I am going to see my optometrist soon, or my ophthalmologist, I should say. She charges me a lot more. People with low pigment density, they found, are at greater risk of developing AMD, age-related macular degeneration. So Haydenger's brust polarization has become useful in the past. We have access to it with the human eye as it is, and it's called adaptive optics. And really, we don't really make use of adaptive optics the way astronomers do. In reflecting telescopes, an astronomer can employ, it's called a deformable mirror. This was invented in part at the University of California by an eminent astronomer, Claire Max. I hope to have her on someday, and colleagues. And it was classified information because it was used in the military. And so in that situation, you produce an artificial or guide star from a laser that illuminates a sodium atom in the upper atmosphere. It makes an artificial star, and then knowing what the star should look like, the pattern of the star, the mirror can be deformed to exactly counteract the turbulence in the Earth's atmosphere that leads to scintillation. The famous song Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star is a real phenomenon. Stars twinkle in atmospheres like ours. They don't twinkle in space. You can get rid of that twinkling, which is caused by differing refractive indices. It's effectively like little tiny lenses that are coming into and out of the beam of your eye or the telescope. And you can actually correct that in a telescope. We can't really correct it with our eyes. By making an artificial star, you can effectively make a correction, and in a deformable mirror, you can make a deflection. And there you can see much clearer to much greater distances, even rivaling a space telescope, effectively freezing the atmosphere over short periods of time and taking multiple exposures. Now, I've been told by my contacts in the military that this is used in the military for sniper scopes. You can also use this tool during the day. And astronomy has this long history. In fact, the telescope itself was used by Galileo first to garner some cash flow for the old maestro. He showed the Venetian Senate that you could see a ship in the Venetian lagoon with a telescope 3 days before you could see it with the naked eye if you had one of his patented, he didn't patent it, he didn't invent it either, Hans Lippershey did, only a few years later. But old Hans never thought to look up at the sky or sell it to greedy Venetian politicians. At any rate, the telescope has been used for military purposes for, literally 400 years, since the time of Galileo and the Venetian Senate. And there are pictures, paintings, we'll show some of those, of him demonstrating it to these politicians. And that led to him receiving the most important goal of any astronomer or professor, which is he got full tenure and he got an increased startup along with it. Now, when Galileo turned the telescope to the moon, he discovered that there were craters there that didn't exist, as we'll talk about. He also saw the Pleiades, the Seven Sisters, or Subaru, and he made this sketch here that I'll show, which shows 6 open stars. We call it the Seven Sisters because that's the Greek myth of Dionysus. These were his nursemaids that fed him wine, and then he was the god of the grape. I'm not going to get into all that, but Galileo, when he observed the Pleiades cluster, he saw what he called innumerable stars that you couldn't see with the naked eye. He colored those in black to depict things you could only see with a telescope. That's the first example of data science in history, where he was using visualization techniques, early PowerPoint, to emphasize a scientific point that only through the use of a telescope could certain phenomena be witnessed. And he went farther, too far, as he often would do, and he claimed that the whole of the Pleiades was comprised of stars that he just couldn't resolve with his tiny little telescope. He realized the bigger the telescope, the bigger and better the resolution of that telescope. The smaller the feature the telescope can see. And this is a phenomenon that you'll catch if you start buying a telescope. You'll get a telescope of a certain size, and then immediately you'll be thinking about, oh, what could I get with a bigger telescope? And that's called aperture fever. It's a very pernicious disease that has affected me for 4 decades and is done much to my wife's consternation as I take it out of the Keating family budget to keep buying bigger and bigger telescopes. Now, Galileo did things to prove many scientific hypotheses, including the heliocentric model. We've talked about that before. He was right, the Earth does go around the sun, but his evidence was that the tides on the Earth are due to sloshing and squashing of waves and due to the Earth's rotation and revolution about the sun. But that's not true. The moon's gravity, the tidal force of the moon, and to some extent the tidal force of the sun, not the revolution force, but actually tidal gravitational forces. That's what causes tide. He was right, but he was right for the wrong reason, which is a very pernicious effect called confirmation bias. But it's interesting because Galileo, claimed that what he saw was proof. In other words, he called it visual certainty. All you needed to do is to look at something to prove a scientific hypothesis. It's a very dangerous thing because it leaves you susceptible to confirmation bias. As well as why he depicted the moon with this huge crater in the center of it, as seen in the last quarter or first quarter moon, his depictions here, that crater doesn't exist. There is a big crater relatively near the meridian, this prime meridian on the moon, but it's nowhere near as big as depicted. But that's okay. What Galileo was trying to do, again with his forays into data science, was to demonstrate how it felt to see that crater for the first time. So he was conveying an emotion, a feeling, a reaction in a way that you couldn't do with mere words. So this is an example of what's so beautiful about astronomy, why I love it, and why I implore you to get a telescope for yourself or for your children or grandchildren. Because you can't feel what it was like to discover the Higgs boson. You can't feel what it was like to discover the double helix structure of DNA unless you have powerful X-ray machines and all sorts of, the James Webb Space Telescope or the Large Hadron Collider. But you can feel exactly what it felt like to discover that the moon had craters, that the moon had mountains, that the moon had oceans, quote unquote. These were all discovered with Galileo's telescope. The moons of Jupiter were discovered with the telescope of Galileo that's smaller than what you can get for $50 if you go to briankeating.com/hits. I do have a telescope buyer's guide. I don't get a penny from it. Again, as Andrew would say, zero cost to consumer. At least I'm not charging you, but you can buy one for a tiny amount. And then you will not only see what Galileo saw, you'll feel what Galileo felt. How cool is that? And how rare is that? There's no other similarity within all of science. How can we improve our astronomical adventures, our astronomical observations? Oxygen plays a huge role. And at high altitudes like 17,200 feet, where the Simons Observatory is, it can really affect our vision. I remember once on Mauna Kea when I was observing with the Caltech submillimeter observatory right near the Keck telescopes, that if you just held your breath for a little bit at night and then you start to breathe really deeply and even maybe took a hit of oxygen, it wasn't required, but you could, you would see the stars as if they're lasers shooting into your eyeballs. And even higher at 17,000 feet, the view gets better, but there you do need oxygen. And I can take off the oxygen for a second, look at stars, look at planets, and the sensation, the sensitivity is so much better when you start breathing oxygen. They sell oxygen canisters. I'll put a link down below. They're called Boost. You can actually breathe these in. You buy them on Amazon. Again, I don't get a penny from it, but they can be used to improve your night vision. It's a really cool trick that I've used on a few occasions. So try that. Experiment with it. Don't go overboard on any of these suggestions, by the way. I am a doctor, but I'm not a real doctor. Another key fact is dark adaptation. It takes about 30 full minutes for our eyes to become fully adapt to darkness. That's why serious stargazers avoid bright lights before observing, and we typically don't do much visual astronomy when the moon is full. It's very difficult to do that. You can do it. You can look at the moon and you can look at planets, but it's very difficult to see very faint things in the night sky when the moon is out and full. Any other time, a few days before or after, it becomes fine. Physical fitness, because of oxygen, your overall health also affects your cardiovascular health, also affects your proper blood flow to your eyes. They have these tiny vessels, some of the most sensitive things, receptors, nerves are in your eyeballs. This is incredible. Now, there's some lifestyle factors you can improve your optical night sky vision by avoiding or partaking of. So alcohol is a no-no, unfortunately. And this is where Andrew and I agree 100%. I drink, once a week, maybe a glass of wine. That's about it. He steers clear of alcohol, it seems like, pretty much all the time. But for astronomers, alcohol is a no-no. It might be tempting to enjoy a hot toddy or Irish up your coffee while you're stargazing. Alcohol can actually impair your night vision. Caffeine, a cup of coffee might help you stay awake, but can make your eyes more jittery, actually. And your hands, if you're moving the telescope also, or the camera, can make it worse. Nicotine, smoking, I enjoy a fine cigar on occasion, but not when I'm stargazing. Not only will the smoke get into your line of sight, it also restricts blood flow, and that is not what you want. The eye needs blood supply for the musculature and also for the readout of the data that your eye is seeing. I mean, this is a tiny fraction of how big the optic nerve is. You can see it's a tiny fraction of just your pupil. It might only be a few millimeters across in most people. And then to constrict the muscles and the blood flow is just awful. So you do want to avoid those things altogether. So that's it for part one, where we've looked deep into the anatomy of the human eyeball and compared it to a telescope. Stay tuned for part two, where we talk about the deficiencies. Even this wonderful instrument has many, many horrible problems with it, as do telescopes. And we'll compare those features in part two. Stay tuned.